Blessings again from Hickory Valley Christian Church. It is an honor to worship with you and now to get into the Word of God with you. We are quickly approaching Easter, and it's such an exciting time, and it's where we really kind of laser focus in on the Son of God, this Jesus, this God that walked in flesh. And I believe that there is so much that we can learn about this radical rabbi who taught in a way that, even though there was some cultural similarities, was so unique, so powerful, and so impactful that thousands of years later, this rabbi is still shaping disciple after disciple after disciple. And I'll tell you, we're going to be in a 4-week series where we just examine the questions that Jesus asked his disciples. I find them so intriguing. And I believe that if this was Jesus' main way of stretching and consuming the minds and hearts of those that followed him, then the same is true for us today. But again, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to begin examining his questions. There's an author that writes for Relevant Magazine by the name of Jennifer Hurd. And she really kind of frames the things that we are going to be talking about incredibly well when it relates to the questions of Jesus. Now, we're going to begin with Thomas today. He's not going to be our main text or our main person that we examine, but there's so much carryover when we do get into Peter and we examine the question that Jesus asked Peter directly. Why do you doubt? Most are familiar with one of Jesus's most intriguing disciples, someone that we don't have a lot of context on. We see some verses and this picture starts to emerge. But Thomas is so interesting and so intriguing, but it was one event in his life that really shaped everything. I'm sure when I said the name Thomas, if you know anything about his story, that you put a word in front of that Thomas. You called him Doubting Thomas. And if you think about it, this was a guy whose friends rushed to him when Thomas was deepest in his grief and he just wanted to be alone. His friends rushed to him and they say, that rabbi that we have been following, that Jesus, he has risen from the grave. He has shown himself to us. And we get one of the wildest events in history where Thomas, deep in his grief, says, until I see the wounds in his hands and touch them for myself, I cannot believe. And so it's funny, it tells you a lot about modern Christianity, but because that's the main story that we have to go on with Thomas, he has a label that he is never going to escape. He'll forever be known as Doubting Thomas. When one of the other examples we had of this guy was someone who was pretty bold and assertive when he said, I know that this town that Jesus is about to take us to is dangerous, but let's go and die. And so it's interesting how he's received this label. But in the spirit of asking questions today, I want to ask you another question. Why do you think that Jesus appeared to all of his disciples at once except for Thomas? Take a moment, wrestle with that. Try to come up with an idea. Was this by chance? Did Jesus say, you know what, I've got most of them, this is good enough? Or was there something deeper below the surface? Was this rabbi who taught in such a radical manner, in this unique way, was he ready to teach Thomas something unique and something new? And this rabbi, he had the power to get all of his disciples together in one room. If he could raise himself from the grave, if he had power over the wind, the wave, and demons, it's not a stretch to say that he could have orchestrated getting the old gang back together one more time. But I believe that Jesus, the rabbi, was setting up Thomas for one more powerful lesson. You see, Thomas, he needed to be pressed a bit further. This ancient rabbi Jesus, who had built his disciples on parables that when you first consumed them, you really didn't understand what it was. It required for you to remove yourself and to just wrestle with the meaning of his words. And for some people, it took decades for them to understand the parables he was teaching. This is one more opportunity for Jesus to teach in an impactful way. The rabbi, when he was teaching in complex parables, he asked deep and cutting questions. And for his disciples, one of the things that we find in Scripture over and over and over again, if you went to Jesus with a question, chances are you are going to get more questions asked back at you. I want to ask you this, as in the spirit of asking questions. Why did Jesus ask so much questions? Why did he ask so many questions? I believe he wanted his disciples and followers to lean in and wrestle with what he was saying. You see, Jesus the rabbi, he was not interested in just creating Christians. He wanted to develop disciples. You see, a Christian is someone who believes. They say, man, there is a God. He died for me. But a disciple is someone who begins to look like their rabbi. They walk the way that he does. They talk the way that he does. And they start to live and move, and all elements of their life begins to reflect their teacher. I believe that Jesus the rabbi was pouring into Thomas. In a world where religion wants to present God as an exclamation point, where the world just wants to say, believe this, do this, this is how you appease the gods. When Jesus came onto the scene, he presented God as a question mark. You see, he wasn't interested in indoctrination. He wanted to liberate. So who is God and who are you? Let's examine one of Jesus' toughest questions found in Matthew chapter 14. "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" He has just fed thousands upon thousands of people with a kid's lunch in the story that we're running up on. The disciples have already seen him heal diseases. They've seen him drive out demons. And then this happens in Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat, by the time, was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said to each other, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." So that's a wild story. You've heard it before, but I want to set the scene and give a little bit of context before we continue and proceed on into this story. This story paints a picture of a group of followers who are absolutely worn out mentally and physically, but they are also eager to see what God has in store for them next. And the reason they're so tired is because this is probably one of the busiest times in Jesus' ministry. There's this period of time where you just get this picture that they're escaping from one event to the next, that they are worried about having, all of these people just hang on to them, and the crowd's becoming so unbearably large that they're not able to do the ministry that they're called to. We also get a sense from Scripture that Jesus is starting to sense that his disciples want to announce his Messiah, that he is the Messiah. And so Jesus even is at this point where he's like, I've got to get these boys away from the crowds. We've got to get some rest. We've got to restore. And so in our story today, Jesus compels his followers to go out onto the Sea of Galilee, to go out ahead of him. If you're not familiar with the Sea of Galilee, it's absolutely huge. And there's so many scary things that happen on it. Weather patterns come and go, and they're incredibly tense. But Jesus sends them out, and he says, I'm going to come out later, but right now I want to stay on my own and pray, but I want you guys to press ahead and go to the next place that we are going. And as the story progresses, we find these exhausted disciples absolutely getting spanked by the winds. Already worn out following Jesus, both mentally and physically, they find themselves dead into the middle of the Sea of Galilee. One of the verses that we read said it was during the fourth watch that this took place. That means that this was between the hours of 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. A quick side story. I was in Bible college, and life was incredibly busy, and they thought it would be a great idea to give me a job from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. I think I stayed awake for a total of of maybe an hour out of the 20 or 30 hours that I was willing to commit to that. It's so difficult. And on top of that, these guys are just physically worn out, emotionally, just all over the place. They're being stretched as far as they can be stretched. So they find themselves in the middle of the Sea of Galilee at night with the winds just absolutely whipping against them, pushing them farther away from their destination. As their arms burned with lactic acid and their vision was limited by the darkness, they witness a figure approach them walking on water. And I love the honesty of their reaction. They scream out, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. And I don't know about you, but I feel like this is quite rational. If I'm absolutely exhausted, if it's darkness, if I'm worried that I'm going to be capsized and I'm going to drown in this terrifying sea, if I see someone walking out, I'm probably not going to be excited about that other little wrinkle that's being added to my situation and my circumstance. But Jesus, the rabbi, his voice emerges from the violent howling wind. And he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." When you hear those words from Jesus, I want you to understand the context so clearly. As the wind is violently howling, the voice of Jesus is louder. It's more forceful. It grabs their attention more than their circumstances do. It's important to note that Jesus, when he approaches them, he doesn't take away their terrifying and scary circumstances. And if I could pause here for a moment, I want to ask you this question. In your life right now, what terrifying circumstances are swirling all around you, where you just want to encounter this Jesus? And maybe you've been praying, "God, take away the storm, take away the violent wind, take away my exhaustion." But Jesus may not change your circumstances. So they are still on the boat in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. It's still 3 a.m. It's windy. He doesn't gently guide them back to this beautiful pasture where he has this picnic of Uncrustables waiting. Jesus meets them in the midst of their terrifying circumstances. He allows them to reconcile their faith with the circumstances that are right in front of them. You see, the rabbi, he wasn't interested in crafting just people who believe. He wasn't crafting Christians. Jesus was crafting disciples in the midst of their terrifying situations. You see, the true character of a disciple, it emerges when they are faced with impossible circumstances. You know, they've seen Jesus drive out demons. They've seen the control that he has over weather. They've heard his teaching and how he puts the Pharisees and the Sadducees to shame. And they've just tasted divinely crafted bread and fish that came from a kid's lunchbox that Jesus multiplied. So I want to ask you this. How will you react when your situations feel impossible? Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 28. "And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus." One of the things that I love about Peter is just how headstrong he is. He's definitely that type A personality, and this perfectly fits his personality. He had this urge come into him. His faith welled up a little bit, and he said, "Man, I've got to act on this. I see Jesus right in front of me. Jesus, if it's you, let me come out onto the water." So he steps out of the boat, and he faces one of his most intense fears that he could ever face. Continuing on in verse 30. "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?'" Earlier, we talked about how Peter got out of the boat, that he faced one of his biggest fears. Now, I'm assuming some things here. But the reason that I assume that this was Peter's greatest fear is because Peter has this track record throughout his time in ministry where he's just so headstrong, but it comes in moments when he's absolutely confident in his own circumstances and his own beliefs and powers. And so Peter at this moment is facing his biggest fear, a moment where he is completely outside of his own control. The only way that he is going to survive is if he really does truly believe that Jesus is more than just a rabbi, but that he's divine. So at this point, Peter is putting his faith into actions. This is a huge moment. Peter, within arm's reach of Jesus, he takes stock of his circumstances. He thinks, man, it's nighttime. I'm standing on water, and the wind is whipping around me furiously. And at that moment, Peter begins to sink. And at this point, Jesus asks him the second most important question that he will ever ask Peter. "O you of little faith, why do you doubt?" I think, man, come on now, Jesus. I can easily answer why Peter would doubt in this situation. He's young, he's tired both physically and mentally. He's at the middle of the Sea of Galilee at 3 a.m. in a windstorm on the very sea that, man, throughout his childhood, he'd heard horror story and scary stories of over and over and over of his neighbors, his friends and family going missing because of how dangerous this sea is. And on top of all of that, he's literally standing on water. There's not a long track record of people standing on water and that being successful. Maybe that's exactly where Peter's mind went when Jesus asked him this question, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" I wonder if internally his first response was to say, "Jesus, it's obvious. Look at my circumstances. Look why I can't overcome this situation that I'm in this moment." Church, if I could be honest with you right now in the moment, that is what separates a Christian from a disciple. A Christian analyzes their circumstances. They analyze their own ability and they say, man, I can't do this, so God isn't calling me to this. A disciple trusts his teacher. He knows that his rabbi is taking him to a good place and is in complete control at all times. Maybe, just maybe, this rabbi was trying to reshape the focus of one of his most important followers. Instead of just seeing the darkness of night, instead of just seeing the unsteadiness of his step as he walks on water for the first time, instead of hearing just violent wind, Jesus may be teaching him this: keep your eyes on the one that has always kept you steady, the one that has always been in control, that one that ran those demons out of that person, that one who created all of this delicious fish and bread that fed thousands, the one who is in control of disease and is willing to come in contact with anyone. Peter shows us this. He shows us the weakness of little faith. And there's a few things that we're going to talk about. This is what little faith looks like. Little faith is often found in places where we expect great faith. There's all these moments in our lives where we think, man, one day God is going to ask me to walk on my own water. He's going to call me to something that is so big and so dangerous and so audacious, and I can't wait for that moment where I step out in faith. Little faith eagerly waits for signs or for God to audibly call our name. It says, man, God, I am totally going to step out in faith and do something big, risky, and dangerous the second that you walk into my room, you call me by name, you take my hand, and you physically drag me to it. Another one, little faith holds a higher opinion of our own strength rather than God's. Next, little faith is affected by its surroundings. Just like Peter, he was focused on his surroundings rather than the hand of his teacher who had never let him down. And last, little faith sees obstacles rather than opportunities. There's statistics that talk about how many churches are in the South. I don't want to give you that again, But most of these churches will stay small gatherings. They will have very little impact on the kingdom. And I believe that it's because a lot of these churches, they only see obstacles rather than opportunities. They analyze their size. They analyze their own giftedness. Instead of saying, you know what? I believe that Jesus is calling us to something bigger and something greater than we can see in front of us. This morning, I want to ask you this. I want you to examine if you have a little faith or if you have a big faith that takes the rabbi by the hand. And the question I want to leave you with is this: why do you doubt? A good way to answer that question is to analyze your own circumstances in your life. Analyze your marriage, analyze your career, analyze your health or the health of your loved ones. Look at your circumstances and say, man, what are these things that I've held up as being unfixable, as being irreparable, something that is always going to hold me back? The quicker that you can examine your circumstances and weigh them against the faithfulness and promises of Jesus, the quicker you will find your rabbi. Church, have a great week.
Promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 That is who you are.
Church, a relationship with Jesus actually begins with just a little faith. We would love to come beside you. If you are starting to question who this God is and you want to know him better, we would love to walk with you during that. If you are someone who says, man, I'm tired of just having a little faith most of my life, and I'm ready to go to that next level. I want to know what it looks like to become a disciple. We want to invite you as well. Let us know what's going on in your life. Let us know how we can come beside you below. And last but not least, one of the ways that you can contribute here at Hickory Valley is by giving your offering. So we want to invite you to do that sacrificially. Give God something that he can work with and do big things with. Church, have a great week. Be the hands and feet of Jesus.